Hi everyone, good afternoon. We'll be starting the webinar in just about a minute's time. In the meantime, if you're joining us, feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us from. We're really glad to have you all here with us. Oh, hi Isabel. Isabel is an old friend from the United Kingdom and works with Freedom for Animals over there. Fantastic. Latricia, Black Pine Animal Sanctuary, Indiana. And Tucson from Jeff Kramer. Hi, Jeff. Oh, fantastic, Kathryn. So wildlife bio student joining from Massachusetts. So we're going to give people a chance to join. We'll probably start at perhaps 1 minute after the hour. So we'll just give people a minute or so to join us before we start. Jeannie and Artemis, that sounds really interesting, from Austin, just up the road from me. I'm in San Marcos. So if you're just joining us, pop in the chat where you're joining us from so we can get to know each other a little bit. Musician, filmmaker, and animal warrior. I love that as a job description. That's great. Hi, Valerie in Miami. All right, so it's 1 minute past the hour. There's still a chance for people to join as we go along, but let's get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Liz Tyson, and I am Programs Director for Born Free USA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today. And during this webinar, we're going to be exploring various aspects of big cat captivity, as well as showing what you can do to help end their confinement and exploitation in the United States. Some of you may already know that Born Free in the last few weeks has released our newest report, Clawing at the Cages, hence the name of this webinar, which explores various concerns around animal welfare, conservation, and public safety when big cats are kept captive. My colleague Devan is going to be talking a bit more about that report during her segment, and you can find the report in full online on our website. We're also delighted to be joined by two other experts in this field, Kate Dylewsky, who played an important role in the introduction of the Big Cat Public Safety Act, and Kathryn Bertok, a sanctuary professional who works with rescued big cats. So the three presentations are going to be followed by a Q&A session. Please enter questions that you'd like to ask our panelists in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will get to as many of those as we can with the time we have. Couple of disclaimers. We are all animal people, and I think every one of our panelists shares their homes with companion animals. So it may be that we get some vocal additions or potentially some visuals of companion animals popping up on the screen. Please bear with us if that does happen. I know that Kathryn is in an area where she's experienced some unpredictable weather, so we're hoping that she can remain online with us, but if we have any connectivity issues, we will work through those as well. Finally, if you enjoy this webinar, which we provide free of charge, we're always grateful for anybody who will donate to allow us to continue our online events. You can donate via a link that will be sent in a follow-up email with the webinar recording in the next few days. Okay, so our first speaker today, Devan Schowe, Campaigns Associate here at Born Free USA. Devan has worked with us since 2015, initially starting out as a caregiver at our sanctuary, moving on to become lead caregiver. She then left us for a couple of years. She went to the UK to study a master's degree in primate conservation, and on her return, joined us again and is now Campaigns Associate for Born Free USA. If you are familiar with our work, you'll be familiar with Devan's work. She's headed up a lot of our major research projects in the last couple of years, including our series on animals in captivity. So without further ado, let me hand over to Devan, who's going to be sharing our most recent work with you all. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction, Liz. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see my presentation by now. So as Liz said, I'm going to be going through our most recent report that we came out with. It's called Clawing at the Cages, Big Cats in Zoos. And I'll just be going through our main findings from this report. And just bear with me, we covered several species of big cats in the report, as well as a lot of different topics. So it was difficult to condense all of that information into this presentation, but I'll be happy to share all of our findings with you. Oh, there we go. Okay, a little bit of a lag. So our key findings from the report, we discovered that big cat health and welfare are severely compromised in zoos. We also discovered that zoos around the world have killed healthy big cats for zoo, quote, management purposes. And many animals have also died from captivity-related causes. And this is particularly important because a lot of the big cat species we're talking about are threatened with extinction in the wild. And so although zoos claim to protect and preserve these species, in a lot of circumstances, they're actually doing the opposite. Inbreeding occurs due to limited genetic diversity within the captive population. Zoos do not contribute meaningfully to the conservation of these species in the wild as they claim to do. Oh, sorry about that. Monitoring of data on big cats in captivity is incomplete. And despite the introduction of the Big Cat Public Safety Act in the US in early 2023, some facilities continue to engage in dangerous activities with them. That puts human public health and safety at risk. So the first issue I want to get into is the exhibit design at zoos and how it negatively impacts the welfare of big cats. So zoos often group animal exhibits based on oversimplified generalizations, whether that's the shared geographic location of the animals or shared climate. So this causes mostly solitary, predatory, and prey species to coexist in unnatural ways. So an example of this is that tigers leave olfactory signals with their scent glands throughout their territory. They engage in nighttime patrols of the margins of this territory, and they also vocalize regularly to reinforce their territory in the wild. And they also do all of these behaviors in captivity, treating their exhibit as their territory. So this often results in elevated frustration level and stress levels in tigers and the other big cats that are nearby them in the zoo. And importantly, the prey species also experience elevated stress level by being made constantly aware of the presence of big cats close by to their enclosures. So you can see on the right, we have a picture of the Philadelphia Zoo map from 2023. And you can see in the red circle there, all of the big cats are right next to each other. So you have the tiger, the snow leopard, the lion, and the mountain lion are all right next to each other. And there are animals that they would consider to be prey species that are either across from them or right next to them. So it's really just a stressful situation for every species involved. So to exemplify this dynamic a bit more, I used the case study of Valerio, who is a male jaguar that in 2018 escaped from his enclosure at the New Orleans Audubon Zoo and killed 9 animals, including 3 foxes, 5 alpacas, and 1 emu. Luckily, no humans were hurt during his escape. The zoo staff were able to contain him safely before that occurred. And notably, Valerio lived his entire life in zoos. He was born at the San Diego Zoo in 2015. So this incident really confirms that animals will retain their natural instincts like hunting and killing live prey, despite being born and raised in a captive environment. So the next topic I want to dive into is the term euthanasia and how it is misleadingly and often wrongly used by the zoo industry. So euthanasia in its truest sense is the humane killing of an animal who is suffering significantly or has a poor prognosis for recovery. And also when it's used in its truest sense, it's really only conducted in the best interest of the animal without considering the best interests of humans. So zoos do kill healthy animals due to, quote, management reasons. And these can vary from spatial, financial limitations. Maybe the animal isn't getting along socially with their group. Maybe the zoo doesn't view them as valuable for future breeding generations. Healthy animals have been killed by zoos for all of those reasons in the past. So IAZA, which is the European equivalent of the North American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, estimates that up to 5,000 healthy animals are killed at their facilities every year. The AZA in North America denied that their zoos kill healthy animals in a press statement in 2015. However, in the US in 2017, 33 unnamed zoos were asked about their killing practices, and 45% of the zoos said they were killing healthy animals. And within this group, 79% were killing mammals. So for our report, the research we conducted was largely on the stud books of each big cat species. And stud books are essentially just the logs of each individual animal involved in the AZA captive breeding programs. So we discovered through this research that altogether, the total deaths of cheetahs, tigers, and mer leopards in captivity due to, quote, euthanasia alone totaled 1,094 individuals. And notably, none of the stud books distinguished between genuine euthanasia, true euthanasia for the animal's best interest, or zoo management euthanasia, which is problematic. We also discovered that 270 total individuals died from injuries from enclosure companions as well. And these are largely in species that are by nature territorial or solitary. So zoos forcing the animals to live with enclosure companions has resulted in fatal outcomes, unfortunately. So moving on to inbreeding, white lions and tigers are color morphs and not actually a rare species like some zoos have led us to believe, though these color morphs do occur in the wild occasionally. Multiple generations have been created by zoos by deliberately inbreeding family members who demonstrate this unique coloration. In 2011, the AZA publicly denounced inbreeding to achieve rare color morphs by saying it has been linked to health issues. But the AZA had previously made no public comment on white color morphs and had kept and bred them since 1960. So scientific research confirming the health issues inbred big cats face, as well as the severe inbreeding levels of big cats in zoos, has been available for the last 40 years. So in spite of this, the AZA had not publicly denounced this practice until 2011, despite being largely aware that this was an issue. Just inbreeding of big cats in general, due to CITES trade restrictions on the import of big cats, and most big cats being born in captivity, because a lot of these species actually do breed pretty successfully in captivity, we can assume that the genetic variation of big cats in zoos is low. And so the result of this is that inbred big cats with low genetic variability experience higher mortality, shorter lifespans, and birth defects, among other health issues. And while zoos rarely release animals into the wild, inbred animals could not ethically be reduced to wild animals, with the risk that they would pass these health issues onto future generations and harm those wild cats. So in terms of conservation, in 2018, AZA facilities spent just 0.1% of their zoo operational expenses on conservation, which is a very minuscule amount. And just to exemplify this, between 2009 and 2019, the Indianapolis Zoo actually spent less on conservation than on the salary of their CEO. So that just goes to show where their priorities really do lie in terms of conservation. So we discovered by analyzing the International Cheetah Stud Book that between 1996 and 2019, just 34 cheetahs were released to the wild until death. And I say until death because that means that none of those cheetahs were recaptured or put back into captivity for any reason. And this is compared to the number in the historic population of cheetahs that were produced at zoos, which totals 10,072 individuals worldwide, starting in 1967. And importantly, none of the other big cat stud books reviewed for our report indicated that any individuals were released into the wild at any time. So last little bit on conservation, hand rearing, as opposed to parent rearing, which would be natural in the wild, is associated with a decreased survival post-release if the animal is eventually released into the wild. And this can be for a number of reasons. It is largely because behaviors that are essential to thrive in the wild, like finding food, shelter, mating successfully, and interacting appropriately with other members of the species, are all things that are learned from parents or other members in the social group, and that is not always present in a captive environment. It rarely is. And hand rearing also causes an unnatural fixation and dependence on humans, which is particularly problematic for those species that are threatened with things like poaching or the pet trade. So we discovered that 250 snow leopards, or 17% of the total population in AZA facilities, were hand reared. And prior to the Big Cat Public Safety Act, big cats had been intentionally hand-reared by zoos to facilitate using them as photo props, because big cats, when they're young, if they're more habituated to humans, they tend to be a bit more easy to work with when they are still juveniles. So loss to follow-up, or LTF, is essentially when an animal disappears or is lost from the records of the stud books. So I have just the numbers of total animals that we discovered had become lost to follow-up in the stud books since they were originally recorded. You can see those. I won't read all of them off, but in total, not including the international cheetah population, 849 total big cats have gone lost to follow-up, so gone from the records within the North American captive populations. And so just to close out here, the Big Cat Public Safety Act was a really wonderful piece of legislation that was passed and did a lot of really good beneficial things for big cats in captivity in the United States. But we did discover that unsafe activities continue even after the passage of the Big Cat Public Safety Act. And these include the fact that employees are still able to handle the animals, including cubs, for photo ops. And they do this by using a flexible, clear barrier to separate the employee and the animal from the patrons. So that results in a continued handling situation with the big cats and humans, so that endangers public safety. We also discovered that there is a use of inadequate or unsafe barriers to separate big cats from the public. And we also discovered that there is a failure to comply with the 15-foot required distance between a big cat and the public if the animal is not in their permanent enclosure. So that happens when animals are in transfer or temporary enclosures, like you see in the top photo at a private event, or in the bottom photo at places like county fairs for animal shows. So our recommendations are just for the zoo community to phase big cats out of zoo collections and captivity in general by ending captive breeding and the wild import of these animals, as it has no benefit to conservation or their welfare. And that concludes my presentation. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I hope everybody learned something new today. And I will go ahead and turn it over to our next speaker, who is Kathryn Bertok. She is the Assistant Director of Carolina Tiger Rescue and was a founding member of the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance. She currently serves as the chair of the steering committee for the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance, and her hope is that one day wildcats will no longer be exploited in captivity. Thank you so much.
Hello, thank you so much for allowing me to join you guys today. I was asked to join the webinar today to kind of go over what are some of the realities of rescuing big cats in the United States. And I wanted to do that by sharing some of the stories of Carolina Tiger Rescue and introduce you to 3 of our animals and the stories of what they had to go through and what they had to overcome in order to as a part of a lot of these trades. So just as a quick, I know that Devan gave a little bit of information, but in case you're not familiar with Carolina Tiger Rescue, we are a nonprofit wild animal sanctuary located in Pittsburgh, North Carolina. We are accredited through the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. And as she mentioned, we are a founding member of the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance. This year, we're celebrating 50 years of rescue, advocacy, and education, and currently are home to over 50 wild animals rescued from private homes, failed facilities, and other types of issues like confiscations. One of the first animals I'd like to introduce you to today is Rajaji. Rajaji spent the first 9 years of his life living in a concrete enclosure in North Carolina. The enclosure itself was actually designed for primates, so it wasn't actually even designed for big cats. So it was a pretty small enclosure. It had a tin roof over the top of it. And so that is where he spent those first 9 years of his life. Sadly, for these types of animals, particularly big cats, this type of a situation that they're living in often leads to some pretty serious medical problems, not the least of which is arthritis through their feet and knees, hips, and back, caused by living on concrete, which is a very unnatural substrate for them to be on. Sadly, arthritis tends to greatly reduce the quality of life for these animals and often really shortens their life expectancy. Cats in particular have really sensitive kidneys that are very delicate and can be damaged with medications pretty easily. So even pain management can become a major issue for these animals, where you either run out of options in order to treat their pain, or their kidneys begin to fail because of trying to take care of that pain. When Rajaji came to us, we were incredibly excited to be able to get him out onto ground and grass and leaves and allow him to really be a tiger for what we can provide in captivity. Sadly, when he first came, he was a little overwhelmed with the prospect of being out in a large enclosure and not having a roof over his head. So it took us a little bit of time to kind of get him to settle in and be comfortable living outside. Once that happened, though, he loved to run and play with leaves. He loved to collect grass underneath him and roll in it, and really became quite a ham and just a very, very lovely tiger to have worked with for as long as we were allowed. But he is a very typical example of when these animals have been kept in these relatively small enclosures with concrete as flooring, and it creates a lot of issues for these guys. The next gentleman that I would like to introduce you to is Tarzan. Tarzan started his life as a photo prop for guests at a hotel in Mexico. And when he was little, it wasn't too much of a problem. They were able to keep him in the foyer of the hotel and allow him to go and have his picture taken. As with most big cats, he eventually started to get a little too big and a little too rambunctious. And they decided that their best option was to keep him in a 3x6 cage for essentially what was going to be the rest of his life. Thankfully, a person from the United States saw him and tried to find a way to get him out of Mexico and back to the United States to enter into a sanctuary. Sadly, even by this time, many of the repercussions of having lived in this small enclosure have already been taking effect on his body. In this picture, you can't quite tell, but he was significantly smaller than other lions. You can see in this picture the roundness of his shoulders, and that is mainly because he was so large and didn't have enough muscle mass in order to be able to hold himself up properly. And so his shoulders kind of rolled out to the side in order to be able to manage his weight. The other issues that he ran into is that his back legs had atrophied and so had not formed completely correctly. And then he had a lot of arthritis through his back and through his hips. Thankfully, he made it to the United States and to a sanctuary where he was allowed to live out his life with his pride of 3. And even though Tarzan was the smallest lion and may not have been in charge of that pride, he was still very much a part of that pride in that they always took care of him, including when they got some really yummy things to eat, they would bring him over some tasty food treats as well. And so we're very thankful that he was able to spend the rest of his life not in the small enclosure, but living his life out with a pride. The last gentleman I want to introduce you to is Capriccio. Capriccio is one of our tigers who started his life off as being a photo prop for a facility in Colorado. Sadly, with this sort of activities, a lot of animals, particularly big cats, start to deal with things like metabolic bone disease. Most of these animals that have been used in this fashion have been pulled from their mothers at a very young age and have not been fed a proper diet. And so sadly, they often have metabolic bone disease where their bones are not strong enough to really support their bodies. And so in his case, he had curvature in his back legs that you can see in these pictures. Sadly, that curvature also led to a lot of damage to his tendons and caused an extreme amount of arthritis. Capriccio's issues were compounded because of his size. This was a particularly large tiger. Capriccio, when he was at his finest, weighed almost 500 pounds, which is a big animal to have on these very weakened back legs. And so you can see that his right leg is well curved and has a lot of tendon damage. But sadly, even his left leg that looked much more normal to the eye had an incredible amount of arthritis by the time he came to call Carolina Tiger Rescue home. So that in turn required us to do a lot of work. We would have multiple procedures with him in order to be able to diagnose what was going on. We had multiple radiographs done. Throughout his time at Carolina Tiger Rescue, we did many things like injections into his knees in order to be able to give him some relief. And then fortunately, just recently, this drug has come out on the market, Solensia, which is a pain medication for osteoarthritis for cats, which is particularly lovely just because it is something that actually doesn't damage cats' kidneys. And so it was kind of a remarkable development. But with that being said, that picture that you can see there of those Solensia vials, that jar holds 1 month worth of medication that would cost over $15,000 a month to try and help keep his quality of life happy and healthy. And so it is not an easy, even with all of the care that we could give, it's not an easy situation for anyone to handle. Now, thankfully, he did get to live out many years of his life with enrichment and enjoying the company of his enclosure mates, who he did get along really well with. And we were happy that we were able to offer him the proper care that he would need. Not only the treating of his pain, but also making sure that he had quality of life. Sadly, many of these stories are just the start of the story, many stories that are out there. There are more animals just like Raja, Tarzan, and Capriccio that still need someone to fight for them. You know, they are a hallmark of some of the things that you can see that go wrong, and yet there are so many more things that still need to be handled. The only thing that gives me any hope is that I know that working together, particularly with this group of people on this call right now, is that we have been able to offer a good home for these animals, but now we get to continue to fight for what is right for them. All of these stories are not easy stories to handle, and they weren't easy stories for us to be able to live with at the time. These all required a lot of medical care. They required a lot of dedication from our staff and through our volunteers and our donors. And we were very happy that we were able to do that. But we appreciate that that's not always the case. And so we look forward to a day when this is no longer needed. So I do want to thank you for allowing me to come and speak with you guys today. It was very lovely, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the Q&A. But before we get to that point, I do want to roll over the proverbial mic to Kate Dylewsky. Kate is the Assistant Director of Government Affairs at the Wild Animal Welfare Institute. She previously worked at Born Free USA and has spent the past decade lobbying at the federal and state levels on issues pertaining to wildlife. She's been a steadfast supporter of captive and wild animals and partners with organizations across the country to push for legislation addressing performing exotic animals, wildlife trafficking, trapping, and other issues. Kate is joining us today to speak about the Big Cat Public Safety Act, both its impact on big cats and where we go from here. And so with that, I will hand things over to Kate.
Hello, everybody. Let me get my screen shared. All right. Thank you all so much for being here today. I am delighted to join my friends at Born Free USA who do such amazing work on wildlife issues. As Kathryn said, I'm Kate Dylewsky. I'm with the Animal Welfare Institute, and I am going to talk to you about the Big Cat Public Safety Act, some lessons that we can take away from getting that legislation passed, and what the next steps are moving forward. So the Big Cat Public Safety Act is a bill that I worked on with many partners for a full 10 years. It was finally signed into law in December of 2022, and it's very exciting to have this law on the books. So this law does two things. First, it bans the pet ownership of big cats. So that means someone like you or me who wants to keep a big cat in a private situation would not be allowed to. That doesn't mean zoos or circuses. We're just talking about pet ownership there. And secondly, the law bans public contact with big cats. This means cub petting, photo ops, any situation in which an exhibitor offers a pay-to-play situation where the public can pay money to interact with these cats. These situations created a breeding pipeline where big cats would be bred to be cubs, to be used for handling. And then when they grew too big and too aggressive, they would be funneled into the pet trade, to roadside zoos, or even disappear into the black market wildlife trade. So in the decade that we spent trying to pass this bill, we learned a few lessons that I think are important and applicable to all future efforts to improve welfare through policy. The first is that we were fortunate enough to amass very diverse stakeholder support for this bill. Some of the partners are right here on the call. Of course, Kathryn mentioned the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance, and that sanctuary network was absolutely instrumental in explaining why this law was necessary from an animal welfare perspective. We also worked closely with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is an accrediting body for those types of facilities. And additionally, we formed partnerships with law enforcement organizations, several of which you can see here: the National Sheriff's Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, Animal Care and Control Association, and all of them joined this fight because this is not just an animal welfare issue. Big cats being kept in private homes also impacts public safety and impacts the first responders who are inevitably called to deal with escapes and attacks. And so all of these partners were really vocal and vital stakeholders who were able to get through to some folks on the Hill that maybe the animal welfare angle was not as persuasive for. The second lesson I want to mention is persistence in the face of a wide array of political obstacles. I think if you'd asked me at the beginning of this fight a decade ago, what arguments would be lobbed against this bill, I could not have predicted half of them. But you can see here, this is a screenshot of a tweet from when this bill went through the House committee, that it really ended up being used as a little bit of a political pawn in some larger partisan fights that were happening, and that it became about so much more than just let's protect these cats or let's protect the communities affected by this, and became sort of a tactic to, to reach across the aisle and put down the other side's priorities. And so it was a matter of maintaining strong champions on the Hill, of being incredibly persistent in our outreach and in our messaging, and about not getting discouraged when a new line of attack was launched, but rather remembering that the coalition and the support we'd built up over those 10 years was strong enough to overcome each new issue that arose. And finally, I want to highlight the importance of grassroots support to this effort. And I want to do this by sharing this screenshot of an article that mentions Tiger King in the headline. I don't think any of us working on this bill could have predicted that truly bizarre docuseries that became such a craze during the pandemic could have actually been an asset to this bill. But it was, in this case, the silver lining of it was that it was a way of communicating about the issue to people who may not have been educated on it otherwise. While there were certainly a lot of salacious and ridiculous parts of it, it ended up being that people really did take away some understanding of the abuse that was inflicted on big cats during the events of that docuseries by those who ran the roadside zoos. And this Big Cat Public Safety Act becoming the, quote, Tiger King bill was one way of raising awareness, putting it on people's radar, giving a shorthand for the legislation. And I think moving forward, while we don't need a peculiar docuseries every single time, I do think it reminds us to be creative and to be dedicated to doing education on the ground, making sure that communities and constituents are aware of the issues that we are lobbying Congress on, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And we really need everybody to understand these animal welfare concerns if we're going to make progress on the policy. So some good news, of course, after this bill passed, we turned to seeing how it would be enforced by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And by and large, what the positive message I want to share is that this bill has been working. The screenshot I have here is of an article about the first charges that were filed under the Big Cat Public Safety Act last year. And we have since seen other prosecutions. We have since seen other agencies citing this law as the reason for pursuing certain policies. This didn't just get signed into law and then disappear into thin air. It is incredibly rewarding to see that it is protecting actual animals on the ground. And it's not just about the prosecutions that are happening and the individual cubs like this one that are involved in those cases. It's also about the chilling effect that having this law on the books has on others who may be interested in getting involved in the pet trade or in owning a big cat for themselves. There's this just desire to avoid breaking the law that most people have, that means that they would no longer be pursuing these activities in the first place. So we're delighted to see that, and to see that the Fish and Wildlife Service has by and large been doing a really, really good job with this law. So finally, I want to touch on what's next. Like I mentioned, the first thing is just making sure that there is strong enforcement of the Big Cat Public Safety Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service created a registry for current owners of big cats as required by the statute immediately after the law was signed. And so they have amassed the list of those who were grandfathered in, and they did that promptly and they did that effectively. They've also released an interim rule to set up some regulations around enforcement, and we were very impressed with their interpretation of the statute and how they put together that interim rule. So we're waiting for that to be finalized, but the progress so far has been good. But as my co-presenters noted, the Big Cat Public Safety Act doesn't cover all situations where big cats are kept in captivity. And it is still legal to have them in zoos. It is still legal to have them in circuses, at least from a federal perspective. And so there needs to be, at the bare minimum, better enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act for the big cats who are still held by exhibitors. And that could be an entire presentation unto itself. But I think Devan touched on some really important aspects earlier of what could be improved with better enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And lastly, we can build on this momentum to pass other legislation. The one that is top of mind for me right now was reintroduced last week endorsed by Born Free and AWI. It's the Captive Primate Safety Act. And this bill would do essentially the same thing as the Big Cat bill. It would prohibit the private ownership of primates because there is unfortunately a thriving pet primate trade, especially on the internet in this country. And this is a matter that has many of the same animal welfare implications and public safety implications. So a lot of the legwork that we've done on big cats can be applied to other species and other policy fights that I hope you will all join us in supporting and pushing for as we move forward on them. So I will stop there. Please do put questions in the chat if you have any for me, and I will turn it back over to Liz for Q&A. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone, again, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. I think what this really exemplifies, so Kate, Kathryn, and Devan have all kind of taken on different areas of this subject. So Devan talking about the research we've done and public education around the issue. Kathryn obviously talking about doing the legwork of caring for big cats when they have been rescued, and Kate obviously talking about moves towards legislation. And I think from our perspective and from all of our panelists' perspective, all of these things are an essential part of the process of protecting animals, because sanctuaries can't do it on their own. I think one thing that Kathryn didn't get into is the sheer cost, and not just in terms of finances, but resources and time that goes into rescuing individual animals. So unless we're really working to cut off the source of animals, so doing the work that Kate's been talking about, getting the legislation in place, getting the bans in place, and as we're talking about the Captive Primate Safety Act coming off the sort of coattails of the Big Cat Public Safety Act, I think all of these approaches have to be combined if we're going to see good results. So really thank you everyone for speaking with us today and just bringing all of those important things together. So we've had some questions come up. Thank you also for keeping on time with your presentations. It means that we've got a good amount of time for questions. So I'm going to start with Devan. And can you just talk a little bit about loss to follow-up and what that is, how it comes about, and what it might mean for the animals?
Sorry, I just realized I was muted. Okay, so what I said is that loss to follow-up can occur for multiple reasons. So it can range from really anything from individuals in private facilities being transferred to undisclosed locations, or maybe facilities losing contact with the stud book keeper before the time the stud book is published. So wherever those animals were transferred to has become lost to the data. In the past, especially before the Big Cat Public Safety Act was passed, we are aware of instances that have been made known by the documentary The Conservation Game, if anyone has watched it, which really did highlight instances that were more nefarious, where big cats were essentially, they ended up in either the pet trade or some other form of the trade of big cats from zoos. And so those big cats ended up becoming lost to follow-up as well, just because they didn't go to another zoo, but they went into another part of the big cat trade. So it occurs for a variety of reasons. And just us quantifying it really helps us understand that the big cats kept in zoos are not contributing to conservation in any way, because if the zoos aren't able to keep track of their own animals, how are we supposed to expect that they can really contribute to genuine conservation in a way that will benefit the animals and their wild populations? So we have also highlighted instances of animals that have gone lost to follow-up in other species. So in our elephant report, we highlighted animals that have become lost to follow-up there. So it really is an issue that we have found across multiple animal species in the zoo industry.
Fantastic. Thank you, Devan. Moving on to Kate, you talked about working on the Big Cat Public Safety Act for a decade. why did it take so long? And is that a really common occurrence with animal welfare legislation, and why? That's quite a big question.
Thanks, Liz. I wish I could say that's not the norm, but unfortunately it is. These types of bills do take time. You have to build the coalition, you have to build the support, you have to do all the educating. It's things that take an enormous amount of persistence and resources. And, it was incredible to get everybody moving in the same direction on the big cats bill, but even with that, we also had to wait for our window of opportunity. Not every Congress is constituted the same, and not every Congress will have the political will or the bandwidth to pass legislation like this. So we seized the moment when we could, but it took a decade to arrive. But to my point about building on momentum from the big cats bill, we're hoping that, given that we've shown this is possible, given that we've shown that it's incredibly popular and that it's effective, that may, grease the wheels a little bit for the next bills that we're trying to pass.
Kate. Question for Kathryn. I think some of the stuff you were talking about with Capriccio was incredibly familiar, and not sure that everybody knows we run a large primate sanctuary at Born Free USA, and the metabolic bone disease, the kind of lack of proper upbringing by parents and families has a large impact on big cats. Can you talk a little bit more about Capriccio's treatment? And also I was dumbfounded by the amount of money that the medication costs as well. That was a comment rather than a question. That was astounding.
And that was only one medication that he was on. So that wasn't even all of his vet care, in a year. Yeah, unfortunately, metabolic bone disease is particularly problematic when you get into especially tigers, just because their body size is so big. And so every impact that you have on the way their bones are formed or where their joints are formed is then multiplied. That problem is multiplied because they weigh so much. And so those bones, where you may be able to handle it a little more easily in a small cat, which sadly they are also often have metabolic bone disease, especially when they come from the pet trade. Almost every small cat we've ever had come in had some sort of metabolic bone disease. But the big cats just really become problematic because of their weight. And so for all of the big cats, I would tell you, if they've had any type of major metabolic bone disease, most assuredly their life expectancy is cut at least by 25%, if not more, depending on how severe it is. Handling it so far as treating it is tricky. Keep in mind that most of these animals all of the big cats that we're working with, these are not animals that you can just handle. You cannot put your hands on them to do an exam. You cannot just ask them to take a pill, and if they don't take it, you pop it down their throat. None of those are options. All of the things that we have to do either have to be done under anesthesia, which is a risk all unto itself, or it has to be done voluntarily by that animal. So Capriccio, thankfully, was just a showstopper when it comes to being an agreeable animal. We did operant conditioning with him for the minute that he arrived on site. We started doing operant conditioning on him because we knew we were going to need him to be willing to accept injections. We knew we were going to have to get him under anesthesia a lot. We didn't want that to be overly traumatic for him. We knew that his kidneys would likely be impaired, so we were going to have to do sub-Q fluids on him. And so we had a staff member here who started with him as soon as he hit our doorstep, and started doing operant conditioning to the point where we could do blood draws from his tail so that we could monitor his kidney health without having to put him under anesthesia. We could give him the Silencia medication that we were giving him for pain, is a sub-Q injection, but they still have to be willing to sit next to a fence and allow us to inject them. And not every animal is going to be willing to do that. And so Capriccio, thankfully, was incredibly willing to work with us, and was just a good sport about letting us do these things to really help him live the best care that we could. And I'll be honest with you, you're right, Liz, I did not really go into the cost of what it takes to take care of these guys, because for many rescues, many sanctuaries, it's not a question of whether or not we'll spend the money. We just, yep, that's what we need to do. So that's what we're going to do. There's no real question. When the Silencia came on the market, it's an incredibly expensive medication, especially when you're doing 30 mils into a tiger every month. It's a lot of medication to go through. And so that was underwritten by one of our donors who we approached and just said, like, we're going to end up spending almost, roughly $2,000 a month on his medical care just for his daily medications. And I don't know that we would have been able to do it without that type of support, but it is an incredibly expensive undertaking, particularly with the big cats. The cost that it is for a small cat, it doesn't get less expensive as they get bigger. They just adds up. And so you are correct. The cost of it is definitely something to consider.
Thank you, Kathryn, not just for the explanation, but also thank you for all the incredible work you're doing to look after these cats. I'm going to jump back to Kate, and then I've got another question for Kathryn, and then I'm going to finish with a question for Devan. So Kate, there's a couple of elements to this question. What obstacles are you seeing with regard to enforcement and penalties? For example, with the Jaguar cub, the people were arrested. There's an assumption that the cub was moved to a sanctuary. Is that the case? And have there been consequences, so sentencing, penalties of the perpetrators, if you know the answers to those?
Sure. So I don't know exactly how that case is working through the courts right now. I don't have information about a timeline on that. But the penalties in the bill, we hope are serious enough to be a deterrent to people who might want to do this. The penalties are up to $20,000 fine and up to 5 years in prison, and each offense each time that somebody is caught doing this constitutes a separate offense. So it is quite steep and quite serious. And, we have yet to see how a judge may decide on sentencing, but would obviously hope that they also make an example and say, yes, this deserves the full penalty, and this is a very serious crime. And so in terms of where the cub ended up from that case, I do believe that the cub was moved to an appropriate facility, but also not something that I was directly involved with.
Thank you. Well, that's good to hear that he or she was sent to a sanctuary, or we hope they were. Just jumping back to Kathryn, you've talked a little bit about some of the big cats you care for being used as photo props. And I just wondered if you could get into that a little bit more for people who are not sure what photo props are, and also that I think there's a lot of confusion around photo props, that kind of big cats can be tamed to be able to do that. So could you just dive into that a little bit more and share a bit more information about what photo props are?
Yeah. So, and obviously a lot of this has changed with the Big Cat Public Safety Act going into effect. Obviously not gotten rid of completely. We still have issues that we're facing, but many of the animals we still have here at Carolina Tiger Rescue were used as photo props. And so this is where females are bred very quickly. Tigers can go back into and get pregnant again once their cubs are taken from them about 6 weeks later. So a lot of these females are what we call it speed breeding, where they are bred. Their cubs are then taken away from them when they are often a day old. We would love for them to have been with mom for a while, but often they are not. They are pulled and they are hand reared in order to make them safer to work with. I use that term very loosely. And then that female will be bred again so that by the time these cubs can no longer be used, there are more cubs that are coming down the pipeline ready to be used in this practice. These cubs, in theory, should not be used as photo props until they're like 8 weeks, and then in theory can only be used until they're 12 weeks. But what often happens is that they're used as soon as they're old enough to be handled by somebody else. They're going to be used as a photo prop. People can come and spend as little as $50, as much as $500 to spend time with these cubs. The problems that we run into a lot with these cubs is that they tend to be malnourished for a couple of different reasons. One, it's expensive to be able to care for them well. And so there's not a whole lot of care put into their diet. The other issue is that in order to keep them more easily handled, they often will just keep them on a bottle far longer than they should, that they would ever be in the wild with mom. They would start meat almost within 2 months, they start eating meat, whereas these cubs will be on a bottle for, upwards of 6 months in order to keep them wanting to interact with the bottle and being willing to be fed by a bottle by whomever would like to pay money for them. And so sadly, that is what you end up seeing at a lot of these facilities, is just the speed breeding of moms, cubs taken away very young. And sadly, most of these cubs end up being very sick. They're handled by people, their immune systems are not developed, and they end up being really sick. And then you have to ask where those cubs end up going when they are no longer able to be used, because that then becomes an issue. And so sadly, we don't always know the answer to those questions. Although, you know, thankfully, some of them do make them into sanctuaries, but many of them do not.
Thanks, Kathryn. All right, I'm going to turn to Devan for the last question before we close out. So Devan, what can people do to help?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Liz, because it seems like a very daunting topic, even with the amazing things that the Big Cat Public Safety Act has caused to happen. So I think the first thing that is accessible to everyone is just to simply stop going to places that have big cats and are actively breeding them in captivity, and also offer those interactive experiences with big cats like photo ops. Just don't support them. And then the hope is that the demand for having big cats in captivity for those experiences will go down as a result. The next thing you can do is you can pop over to our website, bornforusa.org, and you can sign a petition that we have, which is currently addressed to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, just asking them to regulate and monitor these issues that we have seen pop up even after the passage of this legislation. So those examples I showed with, you know, continuing to engage in photo ops, using that clear barrier, and then also just investigate the use of inappropriate barriers, as well as not keeping a safe distance in between big cats that are in transfer cages and the public at, you know, places like county fairs and private events. Just to keep maintaining public safety, which is the ultimate goal of the Big Cat Public Safety Act. And then lastly, I would say also available on our website, you can check out our symbolic adoption program. Right now, you can adopt a lion, a tiger, or a cheetah. And really just doing that will help support us more in our efforts to fight and protect big cats and keep them out of harmful exploitative situations in captivity. So those are 3 things that anyone can do. And we would just appreciate anyone making the effort to do any of those things.
Thanks, Devan. All right, so we'll close out now a couple of minutes early. If we haven't gotten around to a question that you have asked, then we save the chat. And if you're comfortable, we can ping you an email and contact you after the event to answer your question. You're also welcome to drop us a line, info@bornfreeusa.org, with questions for any of our panelists, and we can forward them on. We'll be sending out in the next few days a recording of this webinar, so please feel free to share it with anybody you think might be interested. And as a reminder, you can access our newest report on our website, Clawing at the Cages, which will go into a lot more detail about what we've talked about here today. So finally, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I learned a lot today, and I hope the rest of our audience did as well. Really appreciate you giving the time, and really appreciate all the hard work you're doing. And thank you to everyone in our audience who took the time to join us. And I hope you also learned something and enjoyed spending time with us this afternoon.